I'm Greg Greenwood and welcome to my studio. In this video, I'd like to show you 5 silver solder placement methods that will improve your silver soldering skills. The type or shape of the solder and the tools that you use for solder placement make a big difference in the outcome and success of your silver solder job. Does it really make that much difference? Yes, it does. You want to have the confidence knowing you are soldering using the best methods available to you instead of just hoping and wishing it will turn out okay. Use these 5 methods and you will be soldering with confidence. Let's take a look at the silver solder types and shapes, plus the tools needed for the proper placement methods. The types and shapes of solder that we'll be using are square pallions, balled pallions, strip solder, wire solder, and paste solder. These are the tools that we'll be using for our solder placement methods. We'll take a look at these individually. We need to cut our sheet solder in square pallions. We'll cut these approximately 1 millimeter square, and we'll be using these pallions in several of the placement methods. The first solder placement method is using tweezers. Very direct way of working, simply picking up the pallions with the tweezers and putting them in position at your solder joint. I put this pallion underneath the ring so the ring weight will hold the pallion in position for soldering, heating it up evenly. Be careful using pallions. You can use too much solder, so use the minimum amount of solder so you don't get a big extra glob on the solder joint. Using pallions can leave a residue of extra solder, so you want to make sure that you choose an area that's easily cleaned up. Using the back of this piece is a good area to clean, and so we'll solder from the back. We'll place the pallions with the tweezers, and we can either place them dry or you can dip them in flux before you put them in position. So we'll heat the piece evenly and draw the solder down into that solder seam. But wherever the pallions are, they will leave a residue. So make sure that you can get to those areas and clean them up. You can see the extra residue here, but it's easily gotten to, and we can clean it up fairly easily. Again, use the minimum amount of solder. A great place to use pallions is when you're sweat soldering a small intricate piece onto a larger piece. We simply turn it on over and place the pallions on the back of the smaller piece, and then we can melt them. This is great because of the small intricate parts. We can really control the amount of solder that we put on. Then we flip it on over onto the larger back sheet and heat both pieces evenly. This will melt the solder underneath and give a beautiful solder joint. You can see that it's melted really nice and evenly and has great fillets all along the piece without any cleanup whatsoever. The second solder placement method is using a brush. Use a good sable or camel hair brush. Don't use a plastic one. You'll melt it. You can use the brush simply with a little flux on it to lift the pallions up and then place them in position. And of course, we'd be using this as a cold method. The third solder placement method is using a pick. I like to use a titanium pick instead of a steel pick because the solder will not stick to the titanium. You can use a pick either cold with flux or you can use it hot. We'll look at both methods. Here I'm using the pick cold with a little bit of flux on the end, simply picking up the pallion and getting it ready to put in position on the piece. The square pallions can be melted and balled, and we can use these either cold or hot. To use them cold, we would be using the same methods that we've used so far, the tweezers, the brush, or the pick using flux. We can take the pallions and melt and ball them and pick them up with a titanium pick. It's really neat that the solder does not stick to the titanium, so we can pick that piece of solder up, place it in position, and drop it very, very easily because the solder will not stick to the titanium pick. The question is, why do we even want to ball up a square pallion of solder in the first place? Remember, our square pallions, when they're laying in the solder joint area, they will leave a residue on the solder joint. If we can reduce that area of touch by balling up a piece of silver solder, and it will touch on a smaller spot on the solder joint, there will be less residue. Let's take this piece and we'll solder it with a balled pallion using our titanium pick. Heat it up and put it in so it's touching both pieces at a minimum amount, and we'll heat both pieces evenly. I have used a little bit larger pallion here so you can see it better in the video. Melts really well in there, nice and smooth and clean. After pickling, I haven't touched this at all, and you can see that it's a beautiful, clean joint. So use the balled pallions whenever you can. The fourth solder placement method is cross-lock tweezers and tube using stick feeding. We'll cut strips out of our solder to use for the stick feeding method, and we can hold them with our cross-lock tweezers. Be careful when you're using this because you can use a lot of extra solder here and really flood your solder joint. Heat up your solder joint evenly and watch the flux so you know when the solder should melt. In this one I used it a half a second too early, and it will stick a little bit here, you'll see, and then it flows in really nice. A great place to use the stick feeding method with the strip solder is when you're sweat soldering two pieces together. Use the smaller piece and flood the back with the strip and then flip it on over, and this is a great method to use for real simple shapes. Don't try to use intricate ones. Use pallions when you're using intricate ones. But you can see that this is nice and smooth and soldered very well and very quickly. Another type of solder for stick feeding is wire solder. I like to take the wire and put a little bend in it and slide it into a tube. And the little bend will hold it in the tube nice and securely for stick feeding. So I slide the wire all the way into the tube, and then I can hold it for the stick feeding process. Stick feeding can be very messy, and you need to practice a lot so you don't leave a lot of residue. Try to choose an area in the back of your piece that you can clean up easily. These two wires are a good example of that. You can heat them up and touch them very quickly. This is a good example for production work. You can touch the solder joint and solder it very quickly and move on to the next piece. You can leave very little residue, as you can see on the front. Nice solder joint here, but just a little bit of cleanup, but easily done. The fifth solder placement method is using paste solder with a syringe and or a pick. The silver paste solder comes ground up with the solder in it with a paste flux. You don't have to use any other type of flux using this paste solder. You can use a pick to put it in position, or the paste solder does come in syringes, and so you can simply push it out from the syringe onto the area where you want to solder. I've put some paste solder on this larger ring to show you that it can be used for larger pieces. Normally we use it for real small work, but I like to put it on this larger ring to show you how it does work. It will settle down just like your regular solder, and it will flow in and solder the joint. We normally use it on small jump rings or chains or maybe ear wires. And this shows you that all you have to do is just take that paste, Put it on the solder joint, heat it up with your torch. No other flux is needed, and it will flow right into the solder joint and make a beautiful, smooth solder joint. By understanding and using these 5 silver solder placement methods, you will be more confident and raise your skill level and ability to solder correctly and successfully. Please subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss any of my new videos. I'm Greg Greenwood, and I'll see you next time.